Our first story takes place in an old secluded library tucked away in the heart of a small town. This library had stood for over a century, its shelves filled with dusty tomes and forgotten knowledge. The building itself was a maze of narrow corridors, creaking wooden floors, and dim lighting that gave the place a perpetual feeling of twilight. It was a place where time seemed to stand still and where the shadows played tricks on the mind. The librarians, a small group of elderly women, had long since become accustomed to the library's peculiarities. But for those who were new, like Sarah, a young librarian who had recently joined the staff, the library held a sense of eerie fascination. Sarah was drawn to the library's rare book collection, a section hidden away in the deepest part of the building. It was there that she first heard the whispers. It started as a faint murmur, barely audible over the sound of turning pages. Sarah dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the wind or the creaking of the old building, but as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the books themselves, as if the words on the pages were alive, longing to be read. One evening, as Sarah was closing up the library, she decided to investigate. She followed the sound of the whispers, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The whispers led her to a book that seemed out of place, a large, leather-bound volume with no title on the cover. The horror ambient of the room grew thick as she reached out to touch the book, her fingers trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. As she opened the book, the whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. The pages were blank, but as she flipped through them, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. And then she saw it, a face, faint and ghostly, staring back at her from the pages of the book. The face belonged to a man, his expression one of sorrow and despair. He began to speak, his voice a hollow whisper that filled Sarah's mind. He told her of the library's dark past, of how he had been cursed to remain trapped within the pages of the book for all eternity. His spirit had been bound to the library, forced to guard the knowledge it held, unable to move on. Desperate to free himself, the ghostly figure pleaded with Sarah to read a passage from the book. But as she began to read, the words twisted and changed, the letters rearranging themselves into a message of doom. The walls of the library began to close in, the shelves towering over her as if they were alive. The face in the book twisted into a grin, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Sarah tried to stop reading, but the words forced their way out of her mouth, her voice growing louder and more frantic. The library was alive, and it was feeding off her fear. The whispers returned, now a chorus of voices, all demanding to be heard. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness consumed her was the book slamming shut, trapping her soul within its pages, just like the man before her. The next morning the library opened as usual, but Sarah was gone. The librarians found the book she had been reading, but the pages were blank once again. They never spoke of what had happened, but the whispers in the library grew louder, and the rare book collection became a place where no one dared to venture. Our second story takes us to a grand library in a large city, a place known for its extensive collection of rare manuscripts and ancient texts. The library was a sprawling building with high ceilings, marble floors, and rows upon rows of books that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a place of learning, but it was also a place where shadows lingered and where the past refused to stay buried. Among the library's staff was an elderly librarian named Mr. Thompson, who had worked there for over 40 years. He was a quiet man, always polite, and he knew every book in the library as if they were his own children. But there was something off about Mr. Thompson. He never left the library, and he always seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if he were part of the building itself. One night, a young librarian named Emily was working late, sorting through a collection of old books that had just been donated. The library was empty, the only sound the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. As she worked, she noticed Mr. Thompson standing at the far end of the room, his back to her, his head slightly bowed. Emily called out to him, but he didn't respond. She walked over to him, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room, but when she reached him, he was gone, vanished into thin air. The horror ambience of the library grew heavy, the air thick with an unnatural cold. Confused and a little unnerved, Emily returned to her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and shifting in ways that defied logic. And then she saw him again, Mr. Thompson, standing at the edge of the room, his eyes fixed on her. This time he spoke, his voice a low, hollow whisper. He told her that the library was his home, that he had dedicated his life to preserving the knowledge it held. But there was something he didn't tell her. The library had also become his prison. Mr. Thompson had died years ago, but his spirit remained bound to the library, unable to move on. As the night wore on, Emily began to see glimpses of Mr. Thompson in the reflections of the windows, in the shadows cast by the flickering lights. He was always watching, always waiting. She tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't open, the windows wouldn't budge. The library had trapped her, just as it had trapped Mr. Thompson. Desperate, Emily searched for a way out, but the library seemed to shift around her, the rooms changing, the corridors leading to dead ends. She could hear Mr. Thompson's voice guiding her, but his words grew more frantic, more insistent. He was leading her deeper into the library, to a place where the books were old and forgotten, their pages yellowed with age. In the heart of the library she found a small, dusty room filled with books that had been long forgotten. And there, sitting on a table in the centre of the room, was a single book with Mr. Thompson's name on it. Emily hesitated, but she knew she had no choice. She opened the book, and as she did, the walls of the room began to close in, the darkness pressing down on her. Mr. Thompson's voice grew louder, pleading with her to finish reading the book. But as she read, the words twisted and changed. the letters rearranging themselves into a message of doom. The shadows closed in, and the last thing Emily saw was Mr. Thompson's face, twisted in sorrow as the darkness consumed her. The next morning, the library staff found Emily's belongings, but she was nowhere to be found. Mr. Thompson was also missing, his presence gone from the library, but the small, dusty room in the heart of the library remained, and those who ventured too close could still hear the Our third story takes us to a prestigious university library, known for its extensive collection of ancient manuscripts and rare texts. The library was a place of learning, where scholars from all over the world came to study. But among the collection was a manuscript that was said to be cursed, a book that no one dared to read. The manuscript was an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and filled with strange symbols and indecipherable text. It had been donated to the library years ago, but it was kept locked away in a glass case, away from prying eyes. The librarian spoke of it in hushed tones, and the scholars who had attempted to study it had all met with mysterious accidents. One day, a young professor named Dr. Williams decided to examine the manuscript. He was a skeptic, not one to believe in curses or ghost stories, but as he opened the case and removed the book, he felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature in the room had dropped. The horror ambient of the library grew thick, the air heavy with a sense of dread. As he began to read the manuscript, he noticed that the words seemed to move on the page, shifting and changing before his eyes. The symbols, which had once been indecipherable, began to make sense, forming words that spoke of ancient rituals and dark magic. The more he read, the more the words seemed to pull him in, wrapping around his mind like a vice. Dr. Williams became obsessed with the manuscript, spending hours in the library, poring over its pages. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, his mind consumed by the knowledge the book held. The other professors grew concerned, but he refused to listen, convinced that he was on the verge of a great discovery. But as he delved deeper into the manuscript, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. He started seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision, heard whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The library became a place of horror. The once familiar shelves now twisted and distorted, filled with books that seemed to watch him with malevolent eyes. One night, as he was studying the manuscript, the lights in the library flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the manuscript's pages. The shadows closed in around him, and he heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper that filled him with a sense of cosmic horror. The voice spoke of ancient gods and forgotten rituals, of a power that had been sealed away for centuries. It told him that the manuscript was a key, a gateway to another world, and that by reading it, he had unleashed something terrible. Dr. Williams tried to stop, but the words forced their way out of his mouth, his voice growing louder and more frantic. The darkness closed in, and the last thing Dr. Williams saw was the manuscript's pages, twisting and turning as they came to life, the words spilling out and wrapping around him like tendrils of smoke. The library was filled with a deafening silence, and when the lights came back on, Dr. Williams was gone, the manuscript lying open on the floor. The next morning, the manuscript was returned to its case and the library was sealed off. The professors never spoke of what had happened, but the manuscript remained a source of fear and fascination. It was said that those who dared to read it would be consumed by the knowledge it held, their minds lost to the depths of despair. Our fourth story takes us to a small, remote library in a quiet town, a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The library was a simple building with a single room filled with books and a few tables for reading, but the librarian, Mrs. Henderson, was known for her strange behaviour. She never left the library, and she always seemed to be watching the patrons with a piercing gaze. One day, a young man named Mark came to the library to study for his exams. He noticed Mrs. Henderson sitting at her desk, her eyes fixed on him as he browsed the shelves. It made him uncomfortable, but he tried to ignore it, focusing on his studies. But as the hours passed, he began to feel a growing sense of unease. The library was silent, the only sound the rustling of pages and the ticking of the clock. But there was something else, a faint whisper, barely audible, that seemed to come from the walls. Mark glanced up, but Mrs. Henderson was gone, her desk empty. The horror ambience of the library grew heavier, the air thick with a sense of dread. Mark decided to leave, but as he walked toward the door, he noticed that the books on the shelves were all different. The titles had changed, the covers twisted and distorted, as if the books themselves were alive. He heard the whisper again, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from the very walls of the library. He turned around, but Mrs. Henderson was nowhere to be seen. The library was empty, the shelves stretching on forever, filled with books that watched him with malevolent eyes. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and Mark felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. He tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The windows were dark, as if they had been covered with a thick layer of fog. The library had trapped him, and the whispering voices grew louder, filling his mind with a sense of terror. He heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned around, there was nothing but shadows. Mark ran to the back of the library, hoping to find another exit, but the corridors seemed to twist and turn, leading him deeper into the darkness. The whispering voices were all around him now, a cacophony of sound that threatened to drive him mad. And then he saw her, Mrs. Henderson, standing in the shadows, her eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. She spoke to him, her voice a low, hollow whisper, telling him that the library was hers, that she had been its guardian for centuries. She had been cursed to remain there, trapped within the walls, her soul bound to the books. And now Mark was trapped as well, another soul lost to the darkness of the library. The next morning the library opened as usual, but Mark was gone. Mrs. Henderson was back at her desk, her eyes watching the patrons with a piercing gaze. The library remained a quiet, unassuming place, but those who ventured too close to the shelves could still hear the faint whisper of the books, and the cold gaze of Mrs. Henderson followed them as they left. Our fifth and final story takes us to a large, modern library in a bustling city, a place filled with students, researchers, and book lovers. The library was a state-of-the-art facility, with bright lights, comfortable seating, and all the latest technology. But there was one room that was rarely used. A small windowless study room tucked away in the back corner of the library. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, and those who entered often felt a sense of unease. The horror ambience was thick, the air heavy with a sense of dread. The room was always cold, no matter how warm it was outside, and the lights seemed to flicker, casting long shadows across the walls. One evening, a student named Claire decided to use the study room to prepare for her exams. She had heard the stories, but she didn't believe in ghosts or haunted rooms. As she sat down at the small wooden desk, she noticed that the walls were covered in strange symbols, faintly etched into the plaster. The room was silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. As she studied, Claire began to feel a growing sense of unease. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with a sense of dread. She glanced up at the clock, but the hands had stopped moving, frozen at midnight. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls, and then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The symbols on the walls seemed to move, shifting and twisting before her eyes. The whisper grew louder, filling her mind with a sense of terror. She tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge, and the windows were dark, as if covered in a thick layer of fog. The room began to close in around her, the walls pressing down, the shadows growing longer and more menacing. The whispering voices grew louder, filling her mind with a sense of cosmic horror. She felt as if she were being pulled into another world, a place of darkness and despair. The last thing Claire saw before the darkness consumed her was the symbols on the walls, glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The room was filled with a deafening silence, and when the lights came back on, Claire was gone, the room empty and cold. The next morning the library staff found the study room locked from the inside, but there was no sign of Claire. The room was sealed off, and the symbols on the walls were painted over. But those who passed by the room at night could still hear the faint whisper of the voices, and the lights continued to flicker, casting long shadows